Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. I trust you all enjoyed that lunch. We were speaking over lunches, pointing out one of the most important things you can do at a conference. You know, the talk quality is important and all that, but what's really important is the food. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. I hope you all have done. They certainly seem to be going out of the way to feed us a heck of a lot, so no complaints here. We are moving straight into the first talk of the afternoon in Talk Room 1, which is going to be presented by Johan Beyers. To read Johan's bio, Johan has been developing software for a long time and also builds physical things. He's presented 2 non-award-winning talks at previous PyCons. This will be a 3rd non-award-winning talk, purely because none of our talks are award-winning because we have no awards. You have given me an idea. You win, Johan. Well, you know.
Cool.
Yeah. Johan is currently a senior engineer at Takealot, and once we plugged into the actual laptop,
that help.
Magic, please. Yeah. That's the name of the device it's talking to. It's a black magic card, yes.
There we go.
Awesome.
There we go.
Sorted. That timing is perfect, and we are ready to roll. You good, Johan?
Yes. Am I?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you, Johan.
Right. Okay. So I'm Johan. I build things for Takealot. I'm in our marketplace team, and this is a collection of rants that I've collected over the past 3 years of my time at Takealot. It's called Don't Make Me Think, because we should consider our code the same as we consider UI. And UI should be seamless. It should be in the background. We shouldn't have to think about the underlying stuff. So, where's this coming from? Nope, not welcome to notes. That's definitely not where it's coming from. Sorry, mine. There we go. Right. So, why do we need this? We read a lot more code than we're writing. You're spending a lot more time reading code than writing code. If it's the other way around, you're doing something wrong. Keeping all of that context in your head is very hard. So we try and make it easy. If it's easy, it's automatic. You don't have to think about it. Bit of background on Takealot. We use microservices on Kubernetes, Python and React, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Kafka. Lots of teams. We've got 570 repositories. Actually, I checked now. I think we've got 574 now. That was last week that we had 570. We have more than 300 engineers and hiring. I have to emphasize that. And hiring. Right. So this is a ridiculous oversimplification of 2 of our services. This is for our sellers. We have products and we have sellers. Those are different microservices. We communicate between them via event streaming using Kafka. We have a tiered system where we have the service that talks machine to machine. Then we have a BFF, which is a backend for front end, which is dedicated to a specific front end. And then the front end that's done in React. The BFF is also a Python service. Then we have an API gateway that allows other teams to talk to some of our services. Some of them they still address directly. Like I said, oversimplification. So how do we achieve good UX in our code? Consistency. If something is consistent, you don't have to think about it. Then, naming things. It's a hard problem. Variables for humans, I'll go through that. Those are specific instances where people get things wrong. Then commenting, and then just a few general thoughts on code organization. So, start off with consistency. We are evolved to match patterns. If we see a pattern If we see it the second time, it goes back to our lizard brain, and we don't have to think about it. So consistency in patterns are absolutely automatic, and inconsistent patterns will immediately trigger our fight or flight response, and pull us out of that flow state. Consistency has a few aspects. Project layouts. Just use cookie cutters. If you've got cookie cutters and templates, use them. For setup, we found makefiles very useful. Setup scripts are close second. Formatting, just run black over everything. iSort helps as well. And then Flake 8, obviously, for some other linting. I include use of libraries. I can neither confirm nor deny that some of our front-end systems use 3 different persistence libraries at the same time. I'll just leave that there. Okay. If you return results, return boring results. You do not want your results to be surprising. First of all, fail loudly. Rather than return misleading results, in our case, that might get picked up 3 or 4 systems down the line as misleading. Rather fail loudly. The second item is exactly the same because it's that important. Examples here would be, if there's an error, just return the error. Don't return an empty dictionary or something like that. Again, can neither confirm nor deny that I have done this or have seen this. Return a list with items in it or an empty list. Don't return none, because someone's going to try and iterate over none. And that doesn't work in Python. If you return a dictionary, return all the keys. If you return a subset of the keys, unless the calling system asked for a subset of the keys, they at some point are going to try and access a key that doesn't exist. When you return a structure, return a similar structure every time. And I'll show you what I mean. So at the top, we've got something that returns something reasonable. So if you check it, it can raise an error, or it returns a full dictionary. The second function there is a little bit more subtle. It says messages, but it returns a single string. So when people are going to iterate over those messages, they're going to get messages like B, A, R, space, etc. And it's going to be surprising to them. The last one, I don't know, just don't do it. Because you're returning none, and if there should be an error, and you're returning an incomplete dictionary, even when you're getting the data that you need. Right. Naming things. Okay, so most of you probably know this. This quote. We find misleading names is a major source of confusion. If you call something in a slightly misleading way, it just leads to lots of confusion. So I'm not going to go over general naming methods. There are many cheat sheets, many resources for that. But a few tips. Try and read that in an if statement. You know, if is in stock reads relatively okay. If items are available also reads okay. And I'm so trained in this that I don't know how to do one that doesn't read okay. Don't clobber the built-ins. That's kind of obvious, but I have seen it. No, sorry, I can neither confirm nor deny that I have seen this. Don't reassign something else to the same name. Usually I see this in the middle of functions where you get an input and then you modify it, but still call it the same thing. Massively confusing at the end of the function. I've also seen that people change something from a single item to a list and then don't rename it as a plural. That is very, very painful. Not immediately, but definitely later. Pick conventions. Django ORM conventions. You know, for filters, for example. SQL has conventions. There's a count, limit, offset. CRUD conventions. Create, get, list, update, delete. Those are the 5 that you are going to use 98% of the time. Functions, same thing. Read it in an if statement because at some point you're going to use it in an if statement. And it needs to read like reasonably sounding English. Useful tip there, use a verb object pattern. In other words, list this, delete that, get this, you know, that type of thing. It shouldn't sound like a variable. That normally goes without saying. Again, it doesn't always happen that way, and shouldn't be too long. If you use black, with the default settings, you've got 80 characters. You don't want stuff to wrap too much. If there's an and in the function name, you're definitely doing something wrong. Patterns. If you do have similar calls in your service, use a similar pattern. Don't say get items by ID and the next thing you call list items or whatever. It's confusing if you do it differently. If you have the same pattern, it's easy to understand. You get one, you get all of them. Same thing goes for return values, and don't stray from that. You know, if you if I expect inconsistently named return values from a system, then I'm extra careful. If I get 99% of them in a predictable pattern and the other one is definitely going to trip me up. So across services. So this is more on big services, big microservice setups like we have. Inside your stack, you saw there, we have a seller service, seller BFF, seller front end, and then the seller database. Use the same naming convention all the way through. You know, if you call something a product, call it a product in the front end BFF service and in the database. Just makes things easier. You do not have that luxury if you're working with systems from other teams. So what we found works is translate it at the edges to your terminology. Translate it the moment it comes into your services, and then be consistent inside your services. The other way around is very confusing, and you are at the mercy of the other team's naming conventions and the changes in the other team's naming conventions. Ask me afterwards how I know this. If you change a name, a variable name, go and grep through the code base and just change it everywhere at once. Anything other than that is going to cause you a lot of pain down the line. So, just to take an example from Takealot. So if you look at those things, the one thing that they have in common is they are all referring to exactly the same thing. A SKU is a stock keeping unit, so logistics refers to it that way. ID SKU is because we used to use PHP in the database, so the database column is called that. SKU ID is the more Pythonic way to name it. Our retailer systems calls it a product ID, PID for short. In Marketplace, we used to call it a seller listing ID. That naming was decided, no, that's not the right way. So now we call it an offer ID. But it's all the same thing. I can give an offer ID to a different team. They can take it as a product ID and everything still works. It's the same thing. So this is kind of a view on what you're dealing with when you're dealing with a whole bunch of disparate systems. Okay, an example of using the patterns. So here I have, the details aren't important, but you can see I have two methods that return something similar. Each one of them have a different way of representing it. Now the question becomes, how do I fetch a list of cats? I don't know. I really don't know. It can be either one of those, or it can be a mix between the two. If I had two consistent systems, I can actually guess what I should be asking for if I want to get a list of cats. Right. Now we're getting to some particulars. Words have meaning, and humans care about that meaning. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So let's start at pagination. Please, page numbers start at 1. They don't start at 0. And it's not a very difficult way to, a difficult process to translate them. But you need to translate them because you don't want to feed page numbers that start at 0 to other services. Again, ask me how I know. Dates. Okay. Dates are just a nightmare. A couple of things about them. A date range that starts and ends on the same day is not 0 days long. It's 1 day long. SQL dates, when you do a between, are inclusive, but to the start of the last day. This has bitten us in the last month. Anything other than year, month, day representation as a text representation, you should get your developer license revoked. Watch out for time zones. In South Africa, we luckily don't have to deal with a lot of time zones, except for the one where the server might be on GMT or UTC, and we are not. That also causes problems. If you write any date manipulation code, if you test any of it, test date manipulation code. I don't think I've ever written tests for date manipulation code where I wasn't surprised at the outcome. And test the edge cases. Okay, percentages. About a year ago, we had to get data from an older system and put it into a new system. There was a field called discount. So that field had values in it ranging from 0.05 to 45.0. There's nothing you can do with that. We threw away that data. Because discount has no meaning. Discount can be a percentage, it can be a fraction, you just don't know. Especially if it's like that on the front end. If you say discount percentage, you have an expectation. 0 to 100, it can be a float, it works. Same goes for a few other things, you know, markup, storage fee, all of those things, use that naming. Units. As you can see, I've recently dealt with translating between those three formats. If you just have a number, you don't know what that means. If you at least have a centimeter at the end of it, you know what the unit is and you can work with that. And you can work with that very simply. If you have the last option, then you need to do a bit of manipulation because then you're sitting with, okay, if the value is a centimeter, then take it as is. If it's a meter, divide it by 100, you know, all of that type of stuff. It just turns very, very ugly. And again, we use this at Takealot. Everyone messes up addresses. Addresses are like names, but worse. Just use a list of strings. If you try and get meaning out of anything to do with an address, I don't know, feed it to Google. Google can make sense of it, maybe. But building a system to try and make sense from addresses doesn't make sense. So this we found out the hard way, that zip code and postal code is not an int. It is in South Africa. It is in the US. In the UK, it's a 6-letter random number with a dash in the middle. Not a random number, random characters with a dash in the middle. So please don't encode postal code as an int. Right, Booleans. Not going to go too deeply into this, but just use a prefix. I've seen things where it's not clear from the name whether this is a Boolean or maybe an integer value. That's the most common confusion that we see. And same goes for a whole bunch of other things. The reason I say use positive units is you don't want to say is not item out of stock. You want to say is item in stock, yeah, or if item is in stock. Constants. You want to use constants. Please use constants. The next slide will show you why 1 and 3 in Takealot should be used as constants. Put them at the top of the file where they can be found, not hidden inside your methods. Take them out and put them at the top of the file as soon as you can. Comment them. Comment them and make them easy to understand. If you need a group of constants, group them using enums. And this is an example of that. So the top one, minimum delivery time seconds. See, I've got the unit in there. Also see that I did the sum there. Python will nicely abstract that away for you into a constant when it actually converts it to bytecode, as far as I know. But that makes it clear. 60 times 60 times 24 times 5 is 5 days. You know, I think it's 86,500 or something like that. Might be. If you just put a number down there, this is much more readable. In Takealot, our Cape Town warehouse is warehouse 1. Our Joburg warehouse is warehouse 3. And we have the numbers 1 and 3 sprinkled throughout our code base without context, which kind of makes it a little bit difficult when you want to add a Durban warehouse at number 2 or whatever, because you have no idea where it's being used. Especially terrible is if the warehouse ID is not 1. That is not a pretty sight. Comments. Chesterton's fence. I reference this regularly. You don't want to change a piece of code until you know why it's written the way it's written. And comments help with that. You use comments to make things more readable and more usable. So a couple of guidelines. Document why you're doing something. You know, if you add A and B, don't say I'm adding A and B. Say why you're adding A and B. And I'll have some examples of that a little bit further on. Speak to the reader of the comment. Write this as if you're writing it to either your future self or to someone else in your team, preferably someone that's very, very junior in your team. And this is a personal preference. I like to use comments like paragraph breaks, you know, so that the code doesn't read like a big block of code, but is nicely broken up. So specific types of comments. To-dos very seldom actually get done, but it is a good indicator that it might not be doing what you expect because it's not fully implemented. References. Show where you got the information from, especially if it's a nice, clever trick that you got off Stack Overflow. Put the link in there. There's no shame in that. And then rants. I'm particularly fond of this because it tells you why you're doing something, and it's usually quite fun to read because you definitely get the frustration. All right. Code organization. So if you organize your code in a specific way, in a consistent way again, it's easier to understand. You want to do it flat, and you want to do it linearly. Cognitive complexity is a thing. You've maybe heard of cyclomatic complexity as well. It's not entirely the same thing, but deeply nested stuff invites you to get confused. Luckily, if you're using black again, you're limited to 80 characters, so at some point your deep nesting is going to break in any case. All right, when you refactor stuff, what I found works, especially because you are rushed for time, refactor it to just above where it's being used if you're factoring out something. Then move it to the top of the class, private and common methods first. Then you can move it to the top of the file into a helper class or whatever, and then you can move it out into a more usable thing. You don't need to say, oh, I'm using this thing, I'm going to refactor it out into a separate method and then go and dump it in a different package that you then have to import. That's the last step. This is opinion. I like organizing my logic into input cleaning and validation, then run through the path that will make you fail early, and then the happy path. So I've got an example here. So this is a bit of a contrived example. You can see I've got to-dos in the top. So I start with the cleaning and validation. I remove common errors from the human input. I say that this is Postle's law. I think it's can't remember, but it's something like you need to be generous in what you accept, but strict in what you put out. So we know that this is a human input value. We know people are going to add spaces to the beginning or the end and don't realize it. Then I've got another to do because maybe we can actually do without having it as a number. And then we convert to the terminology we use. In theory, I could take that purchase order reference and assign it, just reassign it here. But I don't want to do that because I'm using purchase order ID further on in the method, which is coming. There we go. We're calling an upstream system. If I get it, if I get stupid answers back from the upstream system, I raise a value error. I comment everything because, and that's a bit of a rant, because I want an empty dictionary. I don't want an empty dictionary, but we want to raise an error on that. And then after that, we do the happy path. All of this is pretty straightforward. Right. In conclusion, software is written by humans, for humans. Computers just incidentally execute it every now and again. Always think beyond the small change that you're making at the moment. And keep in mind that if it can be used incorrectly, people will use it incorrectly. If it cannot be used incorrectly, people will also use it incorrectly. And lastly, again, we are hiring. And that is me.
Oh, excellent. Fantastic. Thank you, Johan. I can attest if you've been an old man like me and you've been writing software for as long as I have, and I won't say as long as Johan has, but possibly. I've seen every one of these. I refuse to comment on how many of them I've done, but I've seen all of them. Johan, I assume you've just seen them. You haven't ever committed any of these things yourself, no doubt.
My record on having done them is very, very close to 100%.
I've got some online comments, potentially questions, and if my phone would cooperate, I would. There we go. Yeah. There's basically a couple of people have pointed out online. They also put Stack Overflow's links in their code, and your future self will thank you. And I agree, there is nothing wrong with that. Where the heck you got it from is critically important. Yeah. We do have some time. We open the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions for Johan? Anyone? David back there does.
Not so much a question, but just in the line of the quirks of the talk. The first time I heard the quote of there are two hard problems in computer science, it went like this: there are two hard problems in computer science: cache and validation, naming, and off by one errors.
Yeah.
Which fits so well with your talk that I thought we had to mention it. Which was great. And the other dad joke that I couldn't avoid adding to your talk was, as programmers, we should be really afraid of dates. We should get sweaty palms, especially first dates.
Yeah.
I would just point out, I've also heard it as, there are two hard problems in computer science: cache and validation, naming things, off by one errors, and scope creep.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything for Johan? There's a heck of a lot of useful stuff in there. So, I mean,
Hi, Johan. I'm Stephen. So this is typically, this is obviously aimed at specifically UX of methods and actual code bases. Do you do anything at a systematic level, like domain-driven design, like that across services, or is anything like that you could recommend from a Python sort of perspective?
Not necessarily a lot of that. And yes, that is kind of outside of the scope of what we're doing here. I am trying to get more generic services into our service code bases, so that we have less code to write.
Okay, cool.
I think someone mentioned here the best code is the code that you don't have to write.
Correct.
Further questions? Anybody else?
Thanks, and thanks, Johan. This was a great talk. I think it's also really nice to know that you're not alone in making these things and then coming back to it later and hating yourself for doing these things. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your opinion about test code versus your main code base. Do you relax some of these things in that context? I tend to sometimes give myself permission to write slightly worse code in tests, but sometimes think that's a bad idea.
Yes, because if you write non-working code in the test, it's not going to pass. So, okay, I've seen exceptions to that as well. But yes, your test code should be a little bit dumber than your normal code. Don't do fancy tricks like iterating through things in your test code, except if you've got PyTest, which has got a very nice parameterized functionality, which I use extensively. Basically don't try and be too clever. tests can be much more verbose, and you don't worry about that too much.
Cool. Thanks. Well, I've got my back to the audience. Was there somebody? Cool. There was some. You.
On the question about DDD in Python, there was a great talk at last year's conference by Richard on using behave and BDD to kind of do that bridging of the DDD gap. I think also speaks a little bit to testing. So it links to both questions, but go check the archive on last year. There was a nice talk there. Cool.
Perfect. To the front. Anything further? Anybody else? Any questions? Are we all? I think other than that, I think we were all repeating ourselves, Johan, but that was really, really good. Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Right. It is 22. We are back on track. The next talk here will be at 2:45. The only other talk, makes it sound like problematic. The other talk is in talk room 3. That should be wrapping up shortly. So obviously move around if you wish to. The next talk here will be 2:45.